Hey guys, this video is going to explore theme in literature. So first off, you've probably noticed at this point that when we're exploring literary elements, what we're largely getting at is the bigger point, the bigger questions, right? Things like, what does it all mean? What's the point? Or why does it matter? What sort of point is the writer making in the way that they compose their story? And these are what we use all the other literary elements to ultimately consider. Now, these questions are generally speaking questions of theme. And the definition, as your text defines it, is a general idea or insight conveyed by the work in its entirety. So when we're looking at these different literary elements, of course we're looking at the craft and function within the story, but largely what we're getting at is the bigger meaning or bigger purpose that the author intends to portray, and that in itself comes from theme. Your textbook says it very effectively as to how theme works. In most literature, all the elements work together to imply an unstated theme that usually requires rereading to decipher. Even the most careful and responsive readers will likely disagree about just what the themes is or how best to state it, and each statement of a given theme will imply a slightly different view on what matters most and why. This is a highly interpretive part of literary analysis, but for the vast majority of you, all your literary analysis will ultimately be approaching some claim about a piece of literature's thematic implication. Now, does that mean that there's a right answer to theme? No, not necessarily. Again, this is interpretive, like all elements of literary analysis, and theme is perhaps one of the most interpretive parts of it. But it's also one of the most important parts that helps us reveal the larger context and significance of a particular piece of work. Now, to complicate things even further, there's even debate about the most accurate definition of what a theme is. So some scholars believe that a story has one theme. There is a most important message that the writer intends to communicate, and any sort of alternate themes or thematic material would qualify as sub-themes beneath that, whereas others use the term to refer to basically any idea in a story. Essentially, some people believe that a story has one theme and everything else sort of operates beneath that, and others believe that a story can have multiple themes. Now, your text operates with the second definition, that we can have multiple themes within a story, and I think for most people that's probably the more useful concept as you begin your literary analysis. Now, when we're articulating theme, we're generally looking at some noun phrase, right? So examples would be like the loss of innocence or the danger of perfectionism, or it can even be simpler than that, like grief or prejudice. Now, when these become themes within a story, we're not only looking to identify that these are thematic elements of the story, but we're also looking to identify what sort of point the writer is making about those things, right? If a theme is the loss of innocence, what point about the loss of innocence is the writer making? Ultimately, when we're talking about thematic analysis, that's what we're after. When we're articulating theme, you don't want to be too specific. Now, theme is a general idea conveyed through the work, rather than a specific claim about the plot, characters, or setting that is unique to the story. So to use examples from the stories we read in week one way of articulating theme would be like saying, in Hills Like White Elephants, Hemingway shows that talking and truly communicating are two different things entirely, right? That's a general idea about the message that Hemingway means to convey through the larger significance of what he's created there. Now, when we say don't be too specific, this is what we mean. In Hills Like White Elephants, the American man and the girl are in conflict because they're not effectively communicating. Now, this is certainly a fair analysis of the characters and the plot conflict within the story, but this doesn't speak to a larger theme. Essentially, the theme is something that goes beyond the story, some sort of commentary about humans or the way they think or the way they act, whereas these sort of more direct and specific analytical claims are looking at the other literary elements themselves within that story. And as a second example about avoiding too much specificity when you're talking about themes, in A&P, Updike shows the struggle between conformity and rebellion as we come of age. Again, talking about how Updike is speaking to this larger concept that speaks to a larger human issue, whereas something too specific to really apply to theme would be like saying in Updike's A&P, Sammy is drawn to rebellion and learns about the adult consequences of it in the process. In the secondary version, we're looking at a character analysis, whereas the thematic analysis is going to look at the larger implications of that character element. Sometimes people think of theme as the moral of a story, right? What's the moral of a story? And that's actually a bit different for our purposes. So a moral is often some rule of conduct or maxim about how people should behave. So going back to our last video about symbol, allegories are meant to communicate some sort of moral principle, right? But a theme, rather, is more of a general observation or insight about how people do behave. So the difference is that a moral is making some sort of claim or suggestion about what is right or how people should operate within the world, whereas theme is making an observation about how people do operate within the world. And as we all know, that is not always the same thing as how people should, right? Theme can be kind of tricky, but here's some tips for looking at theme within a particular story. First of all, pay attention to the title. Often the title contains some clue or suggestion about the most central topic. So A Rose for Emily is a great example. There are all sorts of layers to that story, right? Old South and New South, and the struggle between sort of traditional values. There's essentially what we assume to be a murder of some kind taking place. But the story is called A Rose for Emily. And Faulkner has gone on record saying that's part of the point he means to convey there. So the title can give us a lot of clues. Also, notice recurring phrases, words, elements, events. Anytime something shows up again and again, it's fair to assume that that's probably central to the writer's point. You also want to identify any claim the narrator or characters make about living, human nature, the world. So as an example, in A&P, Sammy is making claims about the customers in the store, right? He calls them sheep. And he's also making these claims about these people and you know, their scrubby little children and the women who are frustrated and angry and sort of combative with him in a certain way. So when our narrator and a character is making those sort of claims, it's fair to say that the author is making a point. And what that point is part of your thematic analysis. If a character is dynamic, meaning that they change, you want to articulate the truth or insight that he or she seems to discover. So to use A&P as an example again, the final few lines of that story, Sammy tells us that he realized how difficult the world was going to be to him after that. And that's all we get. But articulating an answer to that, what the truth is behind that sentiment or what he means by that, that's definitely going to get you to some thematic perspective that's important to consider when analyzing that story. Finally, you want to identify the conflict in general terms and think about what insight or theme might be implied as to how the conflict is resolved. So how do things, how is the struggle sort of made right in the end? Now, in the case of, Hills Like White Elephants, there doesn't really seem to be a resolution, right? Whereas in a story like The Cask of Amontillado, there is a very clear resolution to the conflict in the story. Now, what sort of implications might the authors be making in those cases? That's something to definitely think about. Conflict is so central to storytelling that whatever sort of resolution comes from that conflict is definitely important to consider. Now, as you continue reading stories over the next week and working towards that literary analysis, I want you to always have theme in the back of your mind, because ultimately, when we're looking at literature, we're looking at what we can learn from it, what the author wants us to take away. And at the end of the day, what they want us to take away can be answered by looking at theme and the commentary that they're making.